welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea announced that it would block and fortify the border with South Korea. North Korean military officers were killed in a Ukrainian missile attack on Russian-occupied territory. Today we discuss how North Korea poses a threat to the region and the world.
러시아와 북한의 어떤 거의 군사 동맹에 버금가는 그런 어떤 이 상호 러브 협약을 맺고 있기 때문에 추가 파병을 할 가능성이 매우 높다.
Это похоже на очередную утку информационную.
Secretary will raise the concerning deepening partnership between Russia and North Korea in his engagements while in Laos.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, the President and CEO of Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Mr. Robert Peters, the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Peters served as the lead strategist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He was also the Special Advisor for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Peters, Ukrainian media reported that 6 North Korean military officers were killed in Ukrainian missile attack on Russian-occupied territory near Donetsk. And Seoul's defense minister said that it is likely that North Korea may send regular soldiers to support Russia. Now, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that it is fake news. Now, given Putin's series of meetings with Kim Jong-un and his advocacy for North Korea, do you think Putin got more than just weapons, namely foreign forces in uniform to support Russia?
I think it's very possible. I mean, all indications are that Russia, like Ukraine, is having serious manpower problems. That is, they've lost so many people in the war in Ukraine that they've been pulling people out of prisons, using contract fighters to go and fight. And there may very well be some real indications that they're using North Korean combat engineers to fulfill specific functions in the war. So these are folks who build bridges, they build defensive positions, et cetera. And that may be because Putin has simply stripped his own combat engineers and put them into frontline forces. Now, if this is true, this raises the question, is it possible that Putin could turn to North Korea to actually provide combat troops for the war in Ukraine, given his own manpower difficulties and how many men he's lost in the war thus far? So I think that is something that we need to be prepared for, is actually seeing North Korean troops engaged in frontline combat operations at some point in the future.
So, Mr. Snyder, North Korean troops engaged in combat operations in the Ukraine war. Wouldn't that make North Korea a completely different actor for Ukraine or other interested parties? And doesn't the international community, shouldn't it react differently to North Korea if it directly engages in this war?
Well, I do believe that the decision to become a direct combatant in the war in Ukraine would change the situation in terms of how the international community would see North Korea. To some extent, this has already begun because President Zelensky called out North Korea and Iran in his UN speech and got a response from the North Korean side. This is a little bit different from the decision on the West to supply arms rather than personnel. And so I do believe that it would generate some questions about how to respond to that on the part, especially of European countries.
So what would be the benefits and risks for North Korea to get directly involved? Inadvertently, North Korea may be making more enemies namely Ukraine? Would the benefits outweigh the risks?
I think there's two dimensions to that. Bob has already outlined some of the benefits that that Russia could get from North Korea's expanded support for Russia in the war. What we don't know is what North Korea is getting in return, the quid pro quo. And so as North Korea becomes more involved, I think that it raises greater concerns about what North Korea might be getting in return. Then there's also the international dimension. And North Korea has already gotten a lot of benefits from Russia's protection through the end of the UN panel of experts and effective implementation of sanctions. But what we don't know is whether or not European countries would be able to mobilize a sufficient set of punishments that would also be a part of that cost-benefit equation.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Peters, North Korea's fingerprints are also all over the Middle East war, and the flow of North Korean missiles and military equipment into Middle East has been there for some time. But with the Hamas attack, the physical evidence came to the forefront. Do you think since the Israel-Hamas war, North Korea has been actively replenishing and strengthening the military capabilities of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iran? And could North Korean weapon become a game changer in the region?
I don't know if they'll become a game changer. I mean, what we are seeing is this kind of sharing of weapons technology between Tehran, Moscow, and Pyongyang. So certain systems, certain rocket and missile systems we're seeing show up in the arsenals of all three of those nations. Drones, you're seeing almost identical drones that the Iranians share with the Russians are then showing up in North Korean stockpiles and so forth. So I think this kind of trade is already happening, and we in the West need to be prepared for really an axis of authoritarians that are willing to cooperate with one another, share technology, share schematics, share designs, and what you see is these three nations all employing basically very similar capabilities in actual combat operations. Will it be a game changer in the Middle East? It's hard to say. I mean, the one thing that's good for us in the West is that most of this technology that they're sharing is simply not very good. Mm-hmm. It's enormously high dud rates, and so, I mean, we've got that going for us.
And Mr. Peters, Israel's concern and opposition to North Korea's missiles and nuclear weapons, to me, seems more stronger than the United States and South Korea. And I've observed a primal fear that North Korea's nuclear and missiles could be transferred to Iran and then could be used to attack Israel. If North Korea's anti-Israel support becomes more belligerent, and if North Korea provides weapons that are more sophisticated, do you think there is a chance that Israel may launch kinetic attack against North Korean facilities like it did to Syria and Iraq in the past?
I would be careful about saying that North Korea would be transferring actual nuclear capabilities, such as a constituted weapon or fissile material to Iran. However, as you pointed out, they have cooperated with Syria in the past on a facility that Israel struck in the 2000s. I don't think Israel would strike North Korea directly. And I think Israel has its hands more than full at this point for fighting a multi-front war. But I think that if there were actual North Koreans in Iran helping them with their missile programs, Israel would not hesitate to strike that facility. And if some North Koreans were killed in that strike, I don't think the Israelis would bat an eye.
Mm. And North Korea continued multiple provocations this week. Mr. Snyder, some politicians in South Korea say that South Korea should prepare for the possibility that North Korea could put anthrax in the trash balloons. Is this something that North Korea may do? And some South Korean authorities also raised the need to have anthrax vaccines. Is South Korea well positioned to defend against such a biological weapons attack?
Well, I think that the right answer is that we would never put it past the North Koreans to try anything in this area of WMD, especially if we think about what happened to Kim Jong-un's half-brother, Kim Jong-nam. But what's interesting is that the biological threat is actually the least focused on and least appreciated dimension of the North Korean WMD threat. And so it is worth thinking about that potential scenario. It certainly is worth investing in vaccines to potentially counter that. And my guess is that actually, regardless of how much preparation has been done, the level of preparation in South Korea for an actual attack of that sort is probably still inadequate.
The trash balloons are already causing a lot of headache in South Korea with the fires, and we're entering into the dry season in South Korea. How much of a nuisance is this?
Well, it's clearly a nuisance. The question is whether it's going to become more than a nuisance. Certainly what's interesting is that the North Koreans also appear to be able to direct the balloons to some degree to particular targets, so I think we need to be careful about that. And then it's really hard to tell whether they have a capacity to escalate in the balloon department. And of course, it also weather has an impact on that as well.
Mm-hmm. And another weapon that North Korea has guidance capability is 240 millimeter controllable multiple rocket launcher shells that they tested this week, claiming the rockets have a maximum range of 41.6 miles. The shells are known to have a guidance system. Mr. Peters, how fast can this weapon make Seoul into a sea of fire that North Korea threatens all the time? And how does a guidance system enhance the capability of this shell? And will they be exported to Russia?
So these type of multiple rocket launch systems have been around since the Second World War. They're not new technologies. The Soviets used them extensively on the Eastern Front against Germany. They are a real threat, to be sure, and they're used for a large area saturation, so they're not really a pinpoint or precision weapon. What they're really beneficial for is in large salvos against a broad target and to create lots of chaos and damage. And so in that sense, Seoul would be kind of a great target for this type of weapon system because Seoul is so large. You can make them more precise. Their warhead is about 50 kilograms, so that does pack a punch. This is simply additive to the long-range artillery that exists on the Kaesong Heights, as well as the North Korean SRBMs. I think what the North Koreans are trying to do is create a lot of targets in the form of cruise missiles, drones, short-range ballistic missiles, long-range artillery, rockets such as these that are meant to overwhelm missile defenses in South Korea and basically make it almost impossible to defend against a large-scale concerted attack against a soft target like Seoul, or even against some harder targets such as large military bases in the South.
Mm. And Mr. Snyder, North Korea has announced that it will completely cut off roads and railways into South Korea and block off and fortify its southern border. What is North Korea's intention and what will be the implications? And do you think this could be a second Berlin Wall that makes the division more permanent?
Well, it certainly is making the division more clear and potentially permanent as there is less interaction between North and South Korea. It's interesting as related to the motivation for North Korea to move in this direction. I think that the bottom line is that as the hermit kingdom, in order to preserve his kingdom, Kim Jong-un has to be a hermit. In other words, he really needs to block off the cultural inflow and other dimensions of South Korean interaction in order to be able to preserve his rule. And I think that that is probably the primary motivation for this set of moves.
Mm-hmm. And experts say that this is Kim Jong-un's preparations to take more hostile posture against South Korea and then to move on to its longer strategies to get U.S. forces out of Korean Peninsula and then forcefully take over South Korea. Do you also agree with that?
Well, that's been a long time aspiration of North Korea, a North Korean-led unification. We do have a change in doctrine, but we don't necessarily have any indications yet of a change in aspiration. And I think the thing that makes it really complicated right at this moment is that on the one hand, we're seeing the renewal of a Cold War environment where North Korea has backing from patrons like Russia. But on the other hand, we see evidence of domestic distress, flooding, Kim Jong-un's references to corruption. And actually the most dangerous phase for North Korea in its experience with the pandemic is re-engagement with the outside world, not the actual threat from a few years ago of the disease itself. And so I am agnostic at this point about what is driving North Korea precisely because I also was expecting more provocations from North Korea in light of its backing from Russia, and yet we've actually seen fewer of the types of provocations than I was expecting during 2024.
Yes, because many experts were earlier in the year, were expecting that 2024 we may even have a war, but we didn't really see a lot of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Peters, South Korean government sees this as North Korea's declaration of more hostilities along the demilitarized zone. Do you think there's now a greater chance of localized conflicts and miscalculations?
So I'm of two minds when it comes to the prospects for war between North Korea and South Korea and the United States, or any coalition of allies. In that, I think the South Korean army on the conventional level could easily handle an invasion by North Korea. I think when you look at the correlation of forces, the type of equipment, the levels of training, the South Korean army in and of itself would handily defeat the North Korean army. So in that sense, I don't worry too much because I think Kim Jong-un knows this. And I think that's why he's leaned so heavily into these kind of asymmetric missile capabilities as well as leaning into his nuclear program. On the other hand, I actually have this strong sense that we may be on the precipice within the next 2 to 5 years or even sooner of being on of a precipice of a no-kidding third world war, in that we have a large-scale land war in Europe with Mr. Putin making explicit nuclear threats against the West. We are on the edge of a large-scale regional war in the Middle East, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades, that could erupt as soon as this weekend. Like, nobody knows, but we are almost there. Things continue to get worse in the Taiwan Straits. And frankly, in Washington, the North Korean challenge, it's not that it's not looked at, but with so much else going on, a lot of times it gets put off to the side. And so if you look across the board, like for me, I see the warning indicators all flashing red. And I truly believe that we could be on the cusp of a third world war between the liberal democracies of the West, to include North America, Europe, and East Asia, versus the authoritarians. And in that sense, I think it could be possible in which if Russia and Iran decide to go, North Korea could say, well, now's the time, guys.
Mm-hmm. But because we're in a strength for strength posture on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea versus United States and South Korea may not have to be a war, but do you think there is a possibility of miscalculation and a localized conflict?
So I think that's always a possibility. And I think that that's been a challenge for at least the last 2 decades, in which there's been the possibility of provocation leading to counter-provocation, leading to miscalculation, and a war that nobody really wants that stumble into. History is replete of examples of both sides stumbling into a war that neither side wants, but once you get to a certain point in the crisis, that neither side knows how to avoid. So I think that's absolutely a possibility. But as Scott pointed out, there were some predictions of that was supposed to happen this year that haven't happened. That said, I think it's still possible.
Mr. Snyder, Kim Jong-un said twice this past week that it's going to nuke South Korea. Do you think there's a real possibility that this could happen?
Well, we have to take seriously the threat. That's what makes a nuclear North Korea dangerous. And moreover, Kim Jong-un has been using the threat of use of nuclear weapons essentially as a suicide pill. In other words, if anybody even so much as threatens Kim Jong-un, he might press the nuclear button, right? And so that's precisely the reason why we have to worry about that. But I think there's another dimension to that as well, and that is that North Korea at this point is relatively weak, and Kim Jong-un must maintain escalation control. And so I think that actually is a factor that may end up explaining why we haven't seen more border area incursions than we might have expected.
Mm-hmm. There's been another op-ed recently warning of possible Second Korean War, and we've seen similar warnings the past 2 years. Do you also agree that South Korea and North Korea are at the most dangerous phase since the Korean War?
I think there are a lot of factors that make it still a very serious potential flashpoint. It's really hard for me to necessarily make that judgment at this point with regards to is it more dangerous than when we actually saw a failure of deterrence. So Bob's warning about a generalized failure of deterrence is very relevant here. But also I think that at this particular moment, essentially what I've been trying to emphasize is that North Korea itself, if there is a miscalculation, is potentially the biggest loser from that potential conflict. And that may be our best hope in a context of deterrence failures in a global context.
Mr. Peters, that op-ed laid out specific war scenarios where North Korea may land on an island near the northern limit line and South Korea responds with air and naval forces. And the second scenario was simultaneous Korean and Taiwan war, where North Korea attacks South Korea when the United States is involved, responding to Chinese attack on Taiwan. Which seems more likely to you? And are United States and South Korea well prepared for such contingency?
So I think both are. I think both are possible. I think it would be in China's interest that if they went for Taiwan, to have North Korea at least engage in high-level provocations to include large salvos of mixed missile attacks, like what we saw with Iran against Israel in April, and then again earlier this month. I think both are very possible. The big challenge is that the United States has depleted magazines of long-range precision fires as well as integrated air and missile defenses. And that's due to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, what we've been doing against the Houthis in Yemen, and also our support to the Ukrainians. Our magazine levels are low. And so in that sense, I do worry that if we got into a shooting war with China over Taiwan, we'd have to throw everything against that war in order to make sure that Taiwan doesn't fall. And we'd say to the South Koreans, look, conventionally, again, you guys can defeat the North Korean army. We're here with the high-end stuff, that is the nuclear deterrence. But I'm not worried about South Korean KF-15s being able to defeat North Korean MiG-17s. Like, I do feel confidence in South Korea's ability to defeat that, but I'm not so confident in our ability to deter and failing that defeat large-scale Chinese aggression across the Western Pacific. And that's what really worries me.
So in the case of Taiwan war, you're saying the United States may want South Korea to defend for itself?
I'm not saying that we would abandon South Korean alliance, but I think the reality would be that every plane, aircraft, ship that we have would have to be focused against China because that is such a larger and more capable threat. And North Korea it is quantitatively and qualitatively inferior to that of the South Korean army. And so the South Korean army would be more than capable of holding against a North Korean invasion of South Korea. It's not to say that North Korea would not inflict some damage. It's not to say that North Korea would not be able to launch a large-scale salvo of mixed missiles and drones, et cetera, against South Korea. But that is not an intractable or existential problem for South Korea, so long as you maintain North Korea, if you use nuclear weapons, we will annihilate your country, and you know we have the ability to do that, so don't even go down that route.
Mr. Snyder, because of the pressing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, there are concerns that Korean Peninsula situation could be put on the back burner. Do you think that is really the case currently?
Well, there's not a war in Korea. And I believe that the U.S.-Korea alliance commitment would actually push Korea to the top of the list if there were an actual outbreak of conflict on the peninsula. And I think that there's data to support that the U.S. public is supporting that prioritization. What Bob is talking about is really more like a division of labor in the context of a partnership. I don't think that it suggests that we are anywhere close to abandoning that partnership.
Mm-hmm. How important is U.S. commitment to defend South Korea in blocking North Korea, Kim Jong-un, from even dreaming about attacking South Korea?
I think the main area that we really see that being directly operative is related to the NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, and to the very clear threat that the U.S. has made as related to the future of North Korea in the event of nuclear use by North Korea.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Peters, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.